Before Apple became a symbol of innovation, elegance, and power, before its logo appeared in millions of hands and homes around the world, it was nothing more than an idea, fragile, uncertain, and easy to dismiss. To understand Apple's story, we must first travel back to the United States in the early 1970s. At that time, computers were not personal. They were intimidating machines locked inside universities, government buildings, and large corporations. They filled entire rooms, cost enormous amounts of money, and required specialists to operate. For ordinary people, computers were distant, cold, and irrelevant. Technology was not friendly, it was not beautiful, and it certainly was not designed for everyone. But change often begins on the margins, far away from boardrooms, far away from approval, and far away from safety. In California's Silicon Valley, a young man named Steve Jobs was quietly becoming restless. Steve Jobs was not an engineer. He could not design circuits or write complex code. What he had instead was something far less measurable and far more dangerous, a deep obsession with simplicity, beauty, and meaning. He believed technology should feel human. He believed machines should serve creativity, not intimidate it. Jobs was intense, emotional, and endlessly curious. He studied calligraphy, explored Eastern philosophy, experimented with ideas that made no sense to practical minds. He did not fit the image of a traditional businessman or inventor, but he carried a powerful question inside him. What if technology could be simple? What if it could be personal? Not far from him was another young man, Steve Wozniak. Wozniak was Jobs' opposite in almost every way. Quiet, shy, and deeply technical, he loved electronics for the joy of problem-solving itself. He could design a computer from scratch simply because he wanted to see if he could. While Jobs dreamed about changing the world, Wozniak dreamed about making machines work better. They had known each other for years. One was a visionary, the other was a builder. Alone, each of them was incomplete. Together, they formed a rare balance. In 1976, that balance would give birth to something extraordinary. They did not have investors. They did not have offices. They did not even have a formal company. What they had was a garage. Behind the house of Steve Jobs' parents in Los Altos, California, the two young men began working on a simple idea: build a computer that ordinary people could use. Not corporations, not scientists, just people. Wozniak designed the machine. It was basic, raw, and far from perfect. There was no screen, no keyboard, no elegant casing, only a circuit board that proved one thing: a personal computer was possible. Steve Jobs saw something more. Where others saw wires and components, he saw potential. He imagined a future where computers were not tools of fear, but tools of freedom, where people could create, learn, and express themselves without needing permission. But belief alone does not pay for parts. Jobs did something that would define his entire career. He took a risk. He sold his Volkswagen van. Wozniak sold his calculator. They borrowed what they could, begged for what they couldn't, and convinced suppliers to trust two young men with no history and no safety net. Then Jobs walked into a local computer store and made a promise he had no guarantee he could keep. He offered to deliver dozens of computers within a tight deadline, machines that did not yet exist. It was bold, it was reckless, and it worked. In that small garage, working late into the night, the first Apple computers were assembled by hand, piece by piece, unit by unit, each one imperfect but alive with possibility. They called it the Apple I. The name itself was unusual. In a world obsessed with technical language and cold terminology, Apple sounded almost playful. It felt approachable, human, unthreatening. That was exactly the point. Apple was not meant to impress engineers. It was meant to invite everyone else in. On April 1st, 1976, ironically April Fool's Day, Apple Computer was officially born. Many would later laugh at the coincidence, but this was no joke. It was the first step of a quiet rebellion against how technology was supposed to look, feel, and behave. The Apple I sold modestly, but enough to prove the idea had value. More importantly, it gave Jobs and Wozniak confidence. Confidence that they were not building a product, they were challenging an entire mindset. Soon after, Wozniak began working on a better version, one that included color, a keyboard, and a clean, friendly design. Steve Jobs pushed relentlessly for simplicity and visual clarity. He cared deeply about how the machine looked, how it felt, and how it made users feel about themselves. When the Apple II was introduced, it shocked the industry. It was not just functional, it was beautiful. Not just powerful, it was accessible. For the first time, a computer felt personal. Sales grew faster than anyone expected. What started in a garage was now spreading into homes, schools, and small businesses. Apple was no longer a hobby, it was becoming a company. But beneath the early success lay a deeper truth. Apple was not driven by money, it was driven by belief. Belief that simplicity could defeat complexity. Belief that design mattered. Belief that technology could be emotional. And at the center of that belief stood Steve Jobs, restless, demanding, and unwilling to accept good enough. The rebellion had begun, and the world had no idea what was coming next. Success did not knock on Apple's door. It exploded through it. After the Apple II entered the market, something rare happened. People didn't just buy the machine, they embraced it. Schools adopted it. Small businesses relied on it. Families brought it into their homes. For the first time, a computer felt less like a machine and more like a companion. Apple's revenue climbed at a speed that shocked the industry. Within just a few years, the company went from a garage operation to a rapidly growing technology powerhouse. Money poured in, employees multiplied, offices replaced garages, dreams became projections, and projections became expectations. By 1980, Apple was no longer an outsider, it was a star. That year, Apple went public. Its shares entered the stock market, and overnight, the company was valued at over $1 billion. Young engineers became millionaires before turning 30. Steve Jobs, still in his 20s, suddenly stood among the wealthy and powerful. But wealth did not calm him, it sharpened him. Steve Jobs did not see Apple's early success as a destination. To him, it was merely permission to go further, faster, and more radically. While others wanted stability, Jobs wanted revolution. While managers spoke about numbers, Jobs spoke about beauty, soul, and the future. Inside Apple, tension began to grow. Engineers valued reliability. Executives wanted predictability. Steve Jobs wanted perfection. He pushed relentlessly. Meetings became intense. Deadlines became impossible. Jobs could be brutally honest, dismissing months of work with a single sentence. To him, mediocrity was a betrayal of the mission. Some employees admired his clarity. Others feared his volatility. Many were exhausted, but no one could deny his influence. At the same time, Apple faced a powerful enemy. IBM, the giant of the computing world, had entered the personal computer market. IBM represented everything Apple was not: massive, conservative, trusted by governments and corporations. To Steve Jobs, IBM was not just a competitor, it was a symbol of a future he refused to accept. Inside Apple, this belief fueled an even greater ambition. Jobs wanted to build a computer that would redefine the relationship between humans and machines, something intuitive, something visual, something that would eliminate fear entirely. That moment arrived when Jobs visited a research facility few people knew about, Xerox PARC. There, he saw something extraordinary, a computer that didn't rely on complex commands, a screen filled with icons, a mouse that allowed users to point and click. In an instant, Jobs understood what others had missed. This was not a prototype, it was the future. He returned to Apple, consumed by urgency. The company had to act immediately. Jobs pulled together a small, elite team and isolated them from the rest of the organization. Their mission was clear and uncompromising: create a computer so simple that anyone could use it. The project was named Macintosh. Jobs told the team they were not merely engineers, they were artists, rebels, people who would leave a mark on history. He demanded total commitment, long nights, impossible goals, and absolute belief. Working on the Mac team felt less like a job and more like a crusade. The result was a machine unlike anything Apple or the world had ever seen. The Macintosh was compact, friendly, and alive with personality. It spoke, it smiled, it invited users instead of challenging them. But behind its charm lay serious problems. The technology was expensive, fragile, and difficult to scale. Every unit cost nearly as much to produce as it did to sell. Jobs knew the product alone would not be enough, so he turned to storytelling. To launch the Macintosh, Apple created a commercial that felt more like cinema than advertising. A dark, controlled world, silent crowds, a single act of rebellion. When it aired during the Super Bowl, it didn't explain the product, it declared war. Apple wasn't just selling a computer, it was selling defiance. When Steve Jobs unveiled the Macintosh on stage, the moment felt magical. The machine introduced itself. The audience erupted. For a brief time, Apple stood at the center of the cultural conversation. But reality arrived quickly. The Macintosh was slow. It lacked memory. It crashed. Businesses hesitated. Sales fell far below expectations. Retailers returned unsold units. Meanwhile, competitors adapted fast. Microsoft, once a partner, began developing its own graphical interface. IBM continued to dominate corporate markets. Inside Apple, anxiety spread. To manage the growing company, Jobs had earlier recruited an experienced executive outside the tech world, John Sculley. Sculley brought discipline, structure, and a focus on long-term stability. At first, the partnership worked, but their visions could not coexist. Jobs pushed for risk without restraint. Sculley pushed for control and caution. Meetings turned hostile. Power shifted. The board watched closely as Apple's internal conflict intensified. Eventually, a decision had to be made, not about products, but about leadership. In 1985, Apple's board chose stability over chaos. Steve Jobs was removed from the Macintosh division. Soon after, he resigned from the company he had helped create. He was only 30 years old. The visionary was gone. Apple survived, but something essential had been lost. The company continued to operate, release products, and compete, but the fire that once defined it began to fade. Innovation slowed, identity blurred. The rebel that had challenged the world was now learning to blend in. And for Apple, blending in would prove far more dangerous than standing out.
When Steve Jobs walked out of Apple in 1985, the world barely noticed. There were no dramatic headlines, no crowds, no farewell speeches. To most people, it seemed like a routine change inside a growing technology company. But inside Apple, something invisible had broken. The company continued to exist. The logo remained. The products kept shipping. Yet the heartbeat was gone. Without Jobs, Apple tried to move forward with discipline and caution. Meetings became quieter. Decisions were safer. Risk was treated as something to manage, not embrace. On the surface, this looked like maturity. In reality, it was hesitation. New Macintosh models were released, but none captured the imagination. They were expensive, confusing, and often late. The product line began to multiply without direction. Different machines served similar purposes, each requiring different accessories, software, and support. Even employees struggled to explain what Apple truly stood for anymore. Meanwhile, the world outside Apple was changing fast. Microsoft had learned from Apple's early innovations and turned them into mass-market weapons. Windows improved quickly, becoming cheaper, more flexible, and compatible with a wide range of hardware. Computer makers like Dell and HP focused on efficiency and scale. They didn't chase beauty, they chased volume. And volume won. Apple's market share began to shrink. Its once loyal customers started drifting away. Developers focused on Windows. Businesses avoided Apple's closed and expensive ecosystem. Slowly, quietly, Apple lost relevance. Inside the company, fear replaced confidence. Projects failed. Products launched without excitement. One highly anticipated device after another missed its moment. What once felt bold now felt uncertain. What once felt visionary now felt outdated. By the mid-1990s, Apple was drowning in its own complexity. Too many models, too many strategies, too many compromises. Financial losses piled up. Cash reserves disappeared. Each quarter brought worse news than the last. At one point, Apple was losing over $1 billion a year. The stock price collapsed. Investors lost faith. Journalists sharpened their knives. Magazine covers asked the same brutal question: is Apple finished? Some called it inevitable. Others called it tragic. Inside Apple, executives debated survival strategies. Should the company license its software? Should it break itself apart? Should it sell to a competitor? No option felt right, but time was running out. By 1996, Apple had less than 3 months of cash left. 90 days. That was all that stood between one of the most creative companies in history and complete collapse. While Apple struggled, Steve Jobs lived in exile. After leaving Apple, Jobs founded a new company called Next. It was built on the lessons he had learned, both successes and failures. The machines were powerful, elegant, and years ahead of their time, but they were also expensive and difficult to sell. Next failed commercially, but its software did not. The operating system Jobs built at Next was stable, advanced, and beautifully designed. Quietly, it became one of the most sophisticated systems in the industry. At the same time, Jobs took another gamble. He bought a small animation studio from George Lucas. That studio was Pixar. What began as an uncertain investment became a creative revolution, redefining animation and storytelling. Jobs was rebuilding himself, learning patience, learning humility, learning how to wait. Back at Apple, desperation forced action. The company needed a new operating system, fast. Its internal technology was outdated and falling apart. After searching the market, Apple made a decision that stunned the industry. In 1997, Apple bought Next. With that acquisition came something far more important than software. Steve Jobs was coming home. There was no celebration when he returned, no victory lap. Jobs walked into Apple's headquarters and saw chaos. Product lines made no sense. Leadership was fractured. Vision was absent. He was furious. In meeting after meeting, Jobs asked simple questions no one could answer. Which products mattered? Who were they for? What did Apple stand for? No one knew. So Jobs took control. He eliminated projects without hesitation. Entire teams were dissolved overnight. Critics called him ruthless. Others called him reckless. But Jobs saw clarity where others saw cruelty. Apple did not need more ideas. It needed focus. The collapse of Apple had come not from competition alone. It came from losing its identity. And Steve Jobs understood something few others did. A company without a clear soul will always fail, no matter how smart its people are. As the walls closed in, Jobs prepared to do what he had always done best: start over.
When Steve Jobs returned to Apple in 1997, he did not arrive as a hero. There were no celebrations, no applause, no promises of redemption. He walked into a company on life support, confused, exhausted, and dangerously close to disappearing. Apple was not broken because it lacked talent. It was broken because it lacked direction. Jobs felt it immediately. Conference rooms were filled with charts, but empty of vision. Product plans stretched endlessly without purpose. Teams worked hard, yet no one could explain why their work truly mattered. Apple had become a company that reacted instead of one that led. Jobs refused to accept that. In his first meetings, he asked a question that sounded simple but cut deeply. What problem are we trying to solve for people? Silence followed. That silence told him everything he needed to know. Jobs stepped into the role of interim CEO not as a caretaker, but as a surgeon. His first act was not to create, but to destroy. He canceled projects without apology. He reduced Apple's overwhelming product lineup to a handful of core devices. 4 products, no more. A desktop and a laptop for consumers. A desktop and a laptop for professionals. That was it. People were shocked. Some executives resigned. Others protested. But Jobs was unmoved. Focus to him was not about doing more. It was about saying no to everything that didn't matter. With clarity came speed. Jobs gathered the remaining teams and issued a challenge. Build something people would love again. Not tolerate, not accept. Love. That challenge became the iMac. From the beginning, the iMac was designed to feel different. Jobs partnered closely with a quiet designer named Johnny Ive, whose sensitivity to form matched Jobs' obsession with experience. Together, they rejected the dull gray boxes that dominated the industry. The iMac was colorful, transparent, rounded, almost playful. It looked alive. Critics mocked it. Competitors laughed. Apple took the risk anyway. The iMac also broke rules. It removed the floppy disk drive, a standard at the time. It simplified setup to minutes instead of hours. It didn't try to impress experts. It welcomed beginners. When the iMac launched in 1998, something remarkable happened. People lined up. In just months, the iMac sold hundreds of thousands of units. Revenue surged. Apple returned to profitability for the first time in years. More importantly, belief returned, inside the company and beyond it. Apple was alive again. But Steve Jobs understood that products alone were not enough. Apple needed to reclaim its story. In 1997, the company launched a campaign that didn't mention processors, memory, or specifications. Instead, it celebrated people, artists, thinkers, rebels, and visionaries, those who challenged the world by refusing to accept it as it was. The message was clear. Apple was not for everyone. It was for those who dared to think differently. At the same time, Jobs made one of the most controversial decisions of his career. He stood on stage and announced a partnership with Microsoft. Many in the audience gasped. Some even booed. Microsoft invested in Apple. Office software remained on the Mac. To outsiders, it looked like surrender. To Jobs, it was survival. He understood something rare in business. Winning does not always mean defeating your enemy. Sometimes it means buying time. Time to rebuild. Time to innovate. Time to prepare the next revolution. And that revolution was coming. Behind the scenes, Apple rebuilt its foundation. A new operating system based on Next's technology took shape, modern, stable, and powerful. Design language became consistent. Packaging turned minimal. The rainbow logo faded into a cleaner, more confident identity. Apple stopped shouting. It started whispering, and people listened. By the early 2000s, Apple had regained trust. The stock price climbed, new products gained attention, but Steve Jobs was not satisfied. He had not returned to Apple to make it stable. He returned to make it unforgettable. And his next move would push Apple beyond computers into culture, identity, and everyday life. By the early 2000s, Apple was no longer fighting to survive. It was preparing to redefine how people lived. Steve Jobs understood something that many technology companies missed. Computers were becoming powerful, but they were still cold, functional, but distant. Jobs believed Apple's future was not inside offices, it was inside pockets, homes, and daily routines. The next revolution would not sit on a desk, it would move with you. At the time, digital music was chaotic, CDs were inconvenient, MP3 players were clumsy. Managing songs felt technical instead of joyful. Jobs saw an opportunity not to improve music, but to simplify it. He challenged his team to create something radical, a music player that felt invisible, no confusion, no effort, just music. In 2001, Apple introduced the iPod. It was small, white, minimal. A single wheel replaced dozens of buttons. It could carry 1,000 songs, an almost unimaginable number at the time. Jobs didn't explain how it worked. He didn't need to. He simply said it fit in your pocket. At first, the iPod was limited to Mac users, and sales grew slowly, but Apple adapted. When Apple released iTunes for Windows, the iPod was unleashed. Sales skyrocketed. White earbuds became a cultural symbol. Apple was no longer a computer brand. It was a lifestyle. Music changed. Apple changed. The world noticed. That same year, Apple did something else no one expected. It opened physical retail stores. While competitors focused on online sales, Apple invested in real-world experiences, clean spaces, open tables, no pressure, just exploration. The stores succeeded beyond imagination. People didn't just shop, they stayed. Apple controlled not only the product, but the moment of discovery. As Apple's influence grew, Jobs aimed higher. He was deeply frustrated with mobile phones. They were ugly, confusing, and restrictive. He believed the phone industry had stopped trying. After a failed partnership with another company, Jobs made a bold decision. Apple would build its own phone. The project was secret, isolated, intense. Engineers worked under extreme pressure. The goal was nearly impossible, a touchscreen device with no physical keyboard that could browse the internet, play music, and feel intuitive from the first touch. In January 2007, Steve Jobs stepped onto a stage and announced 3 products: a music player, a phone, an internet device. Then he smiled. They were one. The iPhone changed everything. There were no buttons, no clutter, just glass and motion. The internet finally felt real on a phone. The interface felt alive. People didn't need instructions. They understood it instantly. Demand exploded. Lines formed around the world. Competitors scrambled. Entire industries shifted. Apple had not improved the phone. It had redefined it. But Jobs went further. In 2008, Apple launched the App Store. Developers everywhere gained a platform. Creativity multiplied. The iPhone became more than a device. It became an ecosystem. A new digital economy was born. Apple's growth was staggering. Revenue soared. Profits multiplied. The iPhone became the company's heart. Apple transformed from a niche brand into a global force. By the end of the decade, it stood among the most valuable companies on Earth. Yet behind the success, time was working against Steve Jobs. Years earlier, he had faced a serious illness. Now it returned, quietly but relentlessly. Jobs grew thinner. His appearances became rare. Rumors followed every public moment. Still, he worked. He believed one more idea remained unfinished. Between a phone and a laptop, Jobs saw a gap, a device for reading, watching, creating, and exploring without complexity. Many doubted it. Tablets had failed before. Critics dismissed the idea. Jobs ignored them. In 2010, he introduced the iPad. It looked simple, almost too simple, but when people used it, they understood. Touch felt natural. Content felt alive. The device disappeared in your hands. Once again, Apple created a category no one realized they needed. Sales exceeded expectations. Skepticism faded. Apple had done it again. But Steve Jobs was running out of time. By 2011, his health had declined visibly. He stepped away from daily leadership, preparing the company quietly. When the moment came, Jobs resigned as CEO, handing control to Tim Cook, a calm, disciplined leader who understood Apple's inner workings. In October 2011, Steve Jobs passed away. The world reacted with shock and grief. Outside Apple stores, people left flowers, notes, and candles. Leaders, competitors, and creators spoke with one voice. They recognized not just a businessman, but a force of imagination. Steve Jobs had not built products, he had built belief. After his death, many wondered if Apple could survive without his visionary, but the blueprint remained. Under Tim Cook, Apple expanded, refining products, scaling globally, and pushing new boundaries. Apple Watch, AirPods, custom silicon, services, sustainability. Apple grew larger than ever. In time, it reached a valuation once thought impossible, $3 trillion, from a garage to a global empire. Yet the true legacy of Apple is not its size, it is its philosophy, that simplicity is powerful, that design is responsibility, that courage matters more than permission. Steve Jobs once said the people crazy enough to think they can change the world are the ones who do. Apple proved him right. And long after devices evolve and numbers fade, that idea remains, quiet, powerful, and alive in every product that dares to be different.